take it away, Cecilia.
Wait, I just need to click that I'm okay with it being recorded. I am. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation and for everyone that's here. As Lucy said, I'm a PhD student at the University of Zurich, and broadly I'm interested in how it is that organisms adapt their social structures to environmental change, and in particular in the case of humans, the role that that may have played in our biological and in our cultural evolution. And now I work on Central African hunter-gatherers, and I use a lot of like paleoclimate models and archaeology and simulations to see how their social structure would have played out over the past 120,000 years. But today I'm going to bring to you a model of socio-ecological changes that happen at much faster timescales, and is based on the work that I did for my master's in the Yucatan Peninsula, looking specifically at how indigenous communities respond to contemporary socioeconomic changes in the way in which they use and think about languages, and how they adapt that to those changing social landscapes. And in a way, I consider languages to be just like any other cultural trait, just like hunting technology or music or anything else that you may think of. So in a way, I hope that with my presentation, I can provide you some sort of generalizable insights that go beyond Mexico or beyond language. Just one thing, please. There are some slides in which I have put like a kind of crossed out Twitter bird. And that's just because some of the stuff is like in review right now. So it would be really nice if you didn't make it public. Okay. So the uniqueness of like human language is just one of those things that has like intrigued people from like pretty much every discipline in the social and biological sciences. And there is a reason for that, and that is that everything that we do as humans relies on language, from learning from others to like interacting with others, from thinking. And therefore people like Steven Pinker, but also many others, have suggested that the way in which we use and think about language is an evolved and universal human capacity. And given that I think that pretty much everything that Steven Pinker says should be questioned before it's made into a book, this is precisely what I'm going to do in my talk, and question that assumption. And I think a good place to start in order to do that is to realize that humans are the only species in the planet that live, whose social organization is structured into these symbolically marked cultural groups that we refer to as ethnic groups, and that by doing so, they've managed to adapt to every ecosystem in the planet. And just to reiterate, by ethnic group, I just mean groups of members who share norms, expectations, and beliefs, and I don't necessarily mean anything biological or race. The point is that these human cultural groups are the main source of human population variation, and that the paleoanthropological research has shown that humans have been marking themselves into these symbolic groups since at least 150,000 years, with ochre and shell beads and all sorts of stuff. And therefore, that suggests that we've been structuring ourselves in this kind of way for like a really long time. Therefore, given that one of the most salient aspects of these cultural groups is the fact that they require common codes of communication and therefore languages, I want to look at the role that language has in allowing humans to live in this very unique way, and therefore in such a diverse set of environments. And in so, I want to kind of argue that in order to understand why humans have language, we need to understand why humans have 7,000 of them. Okay. So again, given that these ethnic or cultural groups require common codes of communication, so that individuals within them can like kind of coordinate with one another, a lot of researchers have proposed that the way in which humans, that linguistic variation in general has played a primary role throughout our evolutionary history in creating, maintaining, and marking this cultural variation between human cultural groups. This is because on the one hand, since people speak different languages in different groups, this would limit the diffusion of institutions from one group to another, and therefore would maintain those cultural groups distinct. But also because the landscapes emerging from such clustering of cultural norms around language boundaries would have created selection pressures in our psychology to then use languages as indicators of other things. For example, if language boundaries match those of cultural groups, one hypothesis is that humans have evolved to use language features as predictors of others' cultural category membership. And then, for example, we could guide our behavior towards others that speak the same language because it would be a proxy of them sharing other cultural norms with us. And in fact, it's been shown in lab experiments that kids as young as 5 months show a looking preference, and by the time that they are 10 months old, they prefer sharing a toy with someone that speaks their own language than with someone that speaks another one. However, and as we have realized in most of the research that we had done in psychology and most of the social sciences, the moment that we look beyond Western environments, we realize that these things are far from universal. And in fact, this is why I like this drawing a lot, because it's drawn by someone from the Martu, which is an Aboriginal tribe in the Western Desert of Australia. And the interesting thing about it is that it depicts the social landscape of this man. And there, the Martu organized themselves into states. And so the big circle that you see is the state to which this man belongs to, and all the links are to other states where he's connected to. And the interesting thing is that states are linguistically heterogeneous, so different people speak different languages within the same state. And the point I want to make is that, okay, if humans were using language indistinctively to guide their social behavior towards others because it would match their cultural groups, for people like the Martu, this would be completely useless. Therefore, I think we need to research under which circumstances individuals' linguistic repertoires distinguish their social behavior in order to understand what are the consequences of acquiring different languages in different landscapes. Okay, no. This is particularly the case now because the world is changing really, really fast, and social landscapes and economic landscapes as well. Many previously subsistence-based communities are becoming increasingly exposed to global economic and educational system, and this often involves exposure to different languages. And at the same time, the rate of linguistic extinction is fastest than it has ever been, with an estimation that by the turn of this century, approximately half of all the world's languages are going to be gone. And it's often thought that these two processes are tied together, that this sort of market integration leads to members of indigenous communities devaluing their own languages in favor of the majority ones, as they are seen to have more status. But we don't know actually the mechanisms by which this happens. We don't know which are the social and economic factors that drive individuals to learn one language over another, to transmit them. And therefore, without having a quantification of this, we cannot predict, on the one hand, the long-term fate of linguistic landscapes, but also we cannot understand how it is that linguistic diversity came to be in the first place. And to try to get at some of these questions, I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've done in the Yucatan Peninsula. And this setting is particularly good to study anything related to linguistic diversity, just mainly because it's one of the most linguistically diverse places on Earth. I'm going to focus on Yucatec Mayan, which is spoken in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it's often referred to as Maya, so I will do that as well. And it has approximately 750,000 speakers, so it's the second most spoken indigenous language in Mexico. And the speakers of this language arrived to the peninsula 1,400 years ago, and they were sedentary student agriculturalists, which is the same subsistence system that people that live there have at the moment. So it's a very, very resilient system. Traditionally, Yucatec Mayan families made their living by harvesting maize, where the household was the unit of production and consumption. This is partly because there is an institutionalized land tenure system that is called the ejido system. That means that communities are granted a certain amount of land, which they distribute amongst their families that live in that community. And therefore, land cannot be sold or inherited, which means that everybody has the same amount of land and there is very little inequality. However, starting in like the 80s and 90s, a lot of changes started unfolding in the peninsula, mostly because of the development of the tourism sector in Cancun and other places nearby, which meant that there were roads being built, that people could access wage labor in urban centers, but also that people could access more mechanized farming methods and education in Spanish, both outside their natal villages, but also within their natal villages. However, rather than this like massive transition to a market economy, what has happened in many places in Yucatan is that certain aspects of the communities have remained like strikingly stable. For example, in most cases, wage labor is seen as a supplement to like the traditional forms of living, rather than a replacement for it. And since this like element of the household is still very much like present, it is very common, for example, if a household has several sons over the age, let's say 15, one of them will go work for wages during the week, and the rest will remain at home like harvesting their maize fields. Hence, in this context, I want to ask, first of all, whether these rapid socioeconomic changes have led to changes in the way in which people use and transmit languages. Once we do that, then to see, okay, can people then, since language is being used in a different way, change the way in which they reason about ethno-linguistic identities in ways that are adaptive in these new landscapes? And the third question, which is not really a question, but more like a reflection that I'll come back to in the end, which is what can this tell us, if anything, about the sustainability of linguistic diversity as well as its evolution? Yeah, so to look at the first question, the first thing that we wanted to see was whether market integration had indeed led to a change in which people use and transmit languages. And for that, we compared the linguistic input that 16 to 24-month-old infants were receiving in two cohorts that were 6 years apart. And even though it was only 6 years apart, across cohorts, there were like big differences in variables related to increased contact with the majority culture, that is the Spanish speakers, education, wage labor, and market exposure. For example, in 2007, children could only complete primary school in their villages, and by 2014, they could finish their school up to university and also completely in Spanish. Also, the educational attainment of caregivers had doubled across cohorts, and there were a lot more wage laborers in the second cohort as opposed to the first. However, and as I said before, there were certain aspects of village life that had not changed at all. For example, age at first birth had remained stable, around 20 years old, and family sizes had also remained stable. And it's common for a woman to have 6 or 7 kids at both time periods. This means that any changes that we observe in the language input that kids are receiving, we know that they are not due to like changes in the general demography of the villages. To quantify this linguistic input, what we did was to obtain recordings of these infants in their home environments, and then to code for every utterance that they received, who it was that had produced that utterance, what language was it on, and whether it was directed to the child or not. And this last distinction is really important because the cross-cultural studies that have been done, including data from this same community, have found really big differences in the amount of directed linguistic input that children get across different settings. And the general finding is that children from these pre-industrial communities receive much less linguistic input to them than infants in Western countries, and also much less input from adults and much more from children. And these directed input differences are thought to be particularly important because they have also been shown to play a role in language learning. So in a way, it is this directed input that predicts word learning afterwards. Therefore, the first thing that we saw that we looked for is like whether across cohort there were general differences in the amount of input that children were receiving. And the funny mountains that you see are the posterior distributions of Bayesian multi-level zero-Poisson models. But basically what you need to look at is the fact that the peak indicates the mean difference across cohorts. So as you can see, contrary to the expectation that market integration would lead to more directed input, just because that is what we see in cross-cultural studies, we saw that actually market integration in these communities had led to a lot less directed input, particularly from children, but also from primary caregivers. At the same time, the number of overheard utterances that children were hearing had remained stable. Nonetheless, and for all utterance types, and this was still the case, most input that children were receiving was from other children as opposed to adults, which is definitely not the case in Western environments. And I guess this was a baseline, but then what we really wanted to know was whether these trends had held, were constant across the two languages that were now available in this community, so whether they had happened differentially for like Spanish and Yucatec Mayan. And this is what we went on to investigate next. And for this, we fitted again based in mixed models to see if the proportion of input in Spanish that infants had received across input types have changed across cohorts. And we found that, first of all, when looking at the total amount of speech, that indeed the total amount of speech in Spanish that children were receiving had doubled across cohorts. But then when breaking that into input types, we found that actually it was the directed input that had doubled in terms of the proportion of it that was in Spanish. The overheard input was still, for the most part, in Mayan, and had definitely not increased across cohorts, as you can see here in the blue graph. Which means, and this was, again, here I show the general plot, but it helped, so it was not because of different people talking to children, but like when we look at different interlocutors separately, the trend holds. So it means that basically caregivers were altering the proportion of Spanish they use when talking to infants, but not when talking to each other. So this was not a language shift in the community, because still the majority language in the surroundings was Yucatec Mayan. Yeah. This also, like in a way subconsciously, means that the amount of speech that kids were hearing in Mayan had decreased a lot across cohorts, just simply because people were targeting input in Spanish to them. So then we wanted to know why. And in order to know why, the first thing that we did is to get over 100 adults from these communities to answer. We first asked them whether they thought that both languages were important, which everyone in the 4 villages that we consulted thought they were. And then we asked them, why did they think each of the languages was important? And as I said, although everybody that we asked said that both languages were equally important and they really believed that there were no differences between them, they did think that they were important for different reasons. When we asked why Mayan was important, people gave answers related to communicating in the local village. People would say things such as it's our tradition, or it's our culture, or like we need to speak to people around here in this way. And this was very different from when we asked them why Spanish was important, where people would give us much more functional responses, such as I need it in order to go to the doctor, or I need it in case I want to work in a city. And I will get more into like this in the following slides, but what these results show, and I think what's important, is that they raise 2 important questions. The first one is, if parents believe that both languages are important and therefore are not trying to shift input away from the local language, why is it that they are targeting directed input in Spanish to their children? And the second question is that, given that they believe that the function of each of the languages is completely different, can they strategize their language choices accordingly? Yeah. So thinking first about like other beliefs that could like trigger sort of these changes, we said, okay, maybe it's not the beliefs about the relative importance of each of the languages, but about the relative ease of acquiring them. And this is because in many small-scale communities, such as the one here, it has been said that it is thought that development kind of comes from within, and therefore that children do not need to be actively instructed in order to develop abilities. So it might be that caregivers don't think that directing input to them in their local language is important for them to develop competences, but that this may differ when an emergent bilingualism comes in, because since they themselves have the experience of having to have learned the language, they may think, they may lead to the erroneous conclusion that the non-local language is inherently more difficult to learn. So in order to explore whether this was the case, what we did was we asked adults whether they believed that children needed to be taught in order to learn how to speak. And then we asked them a follow-up question of whether they thought it was the same for Spanish and for Yucatec Maya. And in response to the first question, pretty much between 70 and 80% of adults independent on the villages thought that infants needed to be actively taught in order to learn how to speak. However, and surprisingly, in response to the second question, around half of them thought that indeed the languages were learned differently, and in particular that Spanish was harder to learn than Yucatec Maya. This means that even if caregivers wanted their kids to acquire equal competencies in both languages, potentially it would pay off for them to preferentially direct speech to them in Spanish, since they thought it was more difficult to learn. And indeed, this is precisely, again, it's not working. This is precisely what we saw. In both cohorts, those caregivers that thought that Spanish was harder to learn were much more likely to speak in Spanish to their children than those that believed that they were equally learned. However, the proportion of people that held this belief was not different across cohorts, and it also didn't depend on the language competences of the caregivers themselves, which means that while this is an interesting finding and an interesting source of within cohort differences, it cannot explain the longitudinal trend that we've observed. So we then turn to, okay, are the changes in socioeconomic landscapes that we've observed led to a strategic reason why caregivers might be doing this? And for that, we looked within cohorts again at what attributes of infants predicted whether their parents would address them in Spanish or not. And I think here it's important to focus on the second plot, because again, is the one that is after market integration. So it's potentially the one that's going to give us the answers to these questions. And the interesting thing is that whilst controlling for the Spanish competences of caregivers, as well as for example, the age of the mom, it is the number of older siblings that you have, the best predictor of how much input you're going to get Spanish. This means, and this is without, like, younger siblings are much more likely to get input in Spanish, while they are not less likely to receive directed input overall or directed input from the caregivers. This means that it's not a classic sort of bias in parental investment kind of thing, but that is very specifically about the amount of input in Spanish that you get. And we were kind of like puzzled by these results and sort of trying to think why this might be the case. And then when we went back again to think about the socio-ecology of this region, we were like, of course. So we've said that market integration has led to, for example, mechanized farming and ways in which like farming can be done more efficiently. But at the same time, there is this system in which land cannot be bought or sold. So families need less people to get the same amount of yield from their farm, and they cannot acquire more land. At the same time, all these new wage labor opportunities that market integration has brought to the communities require, on the one hand, acquiring particular skills such as language, but also spending time periods away from the home village. And again, since the household is the unit of production and consumption, this means that potentially households can embrace this sort of linguistic division of labor between its members, whereby they might, firstborn might specialize in farm work and therefore may need more Mayan, whilst the later borns in wage labor, and then everyone can pool resources and families can have this best of both worlds strategies and access both kind of networks. And this can also be a potential explanation of why fertility has remained so high, infant mortality really low, and even if land is becoming increasingly limited, families are able to sustain these large sizes, and we observe a demographic growth in the village. And this is again illustrated also by the quote that I've put here, and is by one of the older siblings from one of the households that we interviewed. And he was saying, and when I was sort of sharing with him some of the results that I had been finding, he was like, yeah, it's true. Like, our parents tell us to speak to our younger siblings in Spanish until they are around 8, and then we stop and we switch back to Mayan, and I don't know why that is. So to sort of recap what my argument was so far, was that, okay, in these villages, there is these new subsistence opportunities arising from market integration that may lead to different optimal subsistence strategies for different individuals, and that different subsistence strategies, since they are associated with different languages, this may lead to different choices in language socialization that will ultimately result in different individuals within the community having different linguistic repertoires. Again, understanding the payoffs that lead to those choices is vital in order to predict whether linguistic diversity will be maintained or not in the future. However, and now going back to what I was referring to in the introduction, when I was talking about the function of language in creating, preserving, and indexing cultural variation, this heterogeneity in language within a single community means that, again, now we're not having this like language boundary enclosing a cultural group, but you get a situation where in very close-knit cultural communities, you have individuals with completely different language repertoires, which means that the way in which people should reason and even use language in order to guide social behaviors varies, because they can no longer use them as predictors of other cultural traits in the village. But again, if we've evolved to reason about language in a particular way, can we even do this? And knowing whether we can do this at all will again influence, one more time, the payoffs of investing in learning and transmitting language. And ultimately, we need to know this in order to be able to predict the fate of linguistic diversity. So this is what I will talk about next. As I said, it has been said that since humans live in cultural groups and they are delineated by language, that it can be that humans have evolved to use language as a predictor of cultural affiliation. Other researchers have proposed a slightly different mechanism by which essentially they also claim that humans have evolved to use language as markers of others' identity, but more that since we tend to learn language from individuals that are around us during the early phases of development, that this might be because language acts as a kind of probabilistic badge of relatedness, and therefore that is a proxy in order to direct sort of kin-based altruism. And although these two sort of pathways make slightly different predictions, the point that I try to make is that under both accounts, this incipient bilingualism presents a problem. Because if humans have evolved to use language as a marker of social group membership, learning an additional language should be seen as either trying to abandon one's ethnic affiliation or as an attempt to cheat and get cooperation from individuals that otherwise would not cooperate with you. And this means that acquiring bilingual competencies could potentially be sanctioned in these like close-knit cultural communities. However, when thinking about how evolution may have shaped our way of reasoning about ethno-linguistic identities, it also opens another question. And this is because evolution can not only select for fixed responses, but also more broadly to flexible developmental patterns as a means to provide adaptive plasticity so that people can attune to their social landscapes as they change. Consequently, another possibility is that plastic developmental processes allow people to strategically adapt the way in which they reason about language to these rapidly changing environments. So in a way, this is not a nature versus nurture distinction. It's a way of telling apart whether evolution has produced fixed processes or processes that adapt in the degree and nature of their plasticity. And this is what I want to get at next. To get a first glimpse on this issue, what we did was we asked over 130 adults from the same villages as before to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how Mayan they would consider a person under the scenarios that are listed in this table. And I won't go through all of them, but they basically vary in sort of the language that people speak, but also on how did they acquire language. So for example, whether you were born to Mayan parents or adopted by Mayan parents, or whether you acquired Mayan but through marrying a Mayan person. And the idea was that we fitted on the one hand, one set of models with the scenario as predictor, and on the other one where we also included an interaction between scenario and participant-own linguistic competences. And I'll get to why we did this in a bit. But I'll do that as I'll go through the results. So I'll go through this confusing graph with you all. But basically, the first thing that we saw was that indeed linguistic behavior was used as a marker of ethno-linguistic identity, as competences in Yucatec Mayan were necessary in order for people to consider others as Mayan. For example, you see the difference between A and G, where it's like individuals born to Mayan parents, but if you don't speak Yucatec Mayan, nobody would consider you Mayan. But at the same time, people would also believe that a child that is born into a non-Mayan family, as long as they learn Mayan, they could also become Mayan. So they didn't believe that there was anything inherently biological or fixed about this. They did not believe either that acquiring competencies in Spanish was incompatible with being Mayan, and in fact bilinguals were rated somehow as higher in Mayanness than those monolinguals, which means that this ethno-linguistic identity and Mayan as a source of making that inference was not incompatible with acquiring another language. Again, identity was not seen as stable through life or inheritable, and therefore it was not used as a proxy of biological descent. But perhaps more interestingly, we saw that this interaction between individuals' own linguistic repertoires and the ratings was very significant, which means that there is not only a population wide regard of ethno-linguistic identity being a fluid concept, but we also see an inter-individual heterogeneity according to individuals' linguistic repertoires. And before I sort of discuss what this may mean, what we didn't know from the former paradigm is how strong was this use of language as a marker of ethnic identity, because the only information that we gave people was others' language competences, and therefore, you know, we cannot see the relative influence of language as opposed to other things. So what we did in order to assess that was to ask participants to make prediction about strangers based on the language they spoke pitched against the village they came from or the religion they practice. And for that, we basically presented them with drawings of 2 exemplar characters, which in this case would be A and B, and we gave them 2 pieces of information about these 2 characters. This would either be like the religion they practice and the language they spoke, or the language they spoke and the village they came from, or the language they spoke and the religion they practice. I don't know. But anyway, the combination of those 2, and they would differ across both dimensions. The idea was that we then presented them a target character that matched each of the exemplar characters along one dimension. And then we told them the exemplar characters food or friendship preference. For example, we would tell them A is friends of Maria and B is friends of Laura. And we would pick names that didn't match anyone in the village. So Maria and Laura were invented people. And then we would ask them to make a prediction about the 3rd character, like who do you think that they would be friends with? The same person as A or the same person as B, to see which one of the factors they used in order to make that prediction. And what our results showed was that the first 2 bars represents individuals making predictions about food choices, and as you can see, they were equally likely to use language. So this is 50%. If the bar is above this line, it would mean that individuals are more likely to use language than either village or religion. But as you can see, they were equally likely to use religion, village, or language in order to make predictions about others' food preferences. And for friends' preferences, they were even less likely to use language than religion, which means that by no means language is a default in order to make predictions about other cultural norms that may cluster around it, but that individuals make use of different alternative sources of information. So what this and the previous study mean together is that indeed was competences in Yucatec Mayan were strongly tied to perceiving strangers as having a Mayan ethnic identity when individuals had no other information about them. Ethno-linguistic identity was extremely fluid and not perceived as vertically transmitted or incompatible with acquiring competencies in Spanish. And moreover, than when individuals had other more socially meaningful information about others, they didn't necessarily use it at all in order to make inferences about them. This means that we don't find evidence to support the claim that humans have evolved to inevitably use linguistic boundaries as reliable signals of biological descent or cultural affiliation. However, it could be, and skeptics may say, that since evolution happens really fast, selection has been differentially operating on how people should reason about ethno-linguistic identities differently in different groups around the world. But we also don't find evidence for this because we saw that within populations, there was also variation in the way that people use ethno-linguistic identities to reason about others. And in particular, for example, we saw that Mayan monolinguals gave bilinguals higher ratings in Mayanness than those that were bilingual themselves. And if we think about reasons in which this may be adaptive, we can think of, for example, okay, it is bilinguals that serve as bridges between these local communities and the market centers. So potentially, if you don't speak the language, you're even more reliant on having a bilingual that can sort of like help you out in bridging that gap. So our results suggest that the observed intercultural and inter-individual differences in reasoning about ethno-linguistic identity are indeed the result of evolved plastic developmental mechanisms that are sensitive to cultural influence and allow us to strategically behave accordingly. And here we only evaluated whether our own linguistic competencies were a source of intercultural variation, but now we're doing a comparative project with Cristina Moya in the Peruvian Altiplano, where there is not only an incipient language boundary as a product of market integration, but also a very ancient one between Quechua and Aymara speakers. And here we can not only see, we can see potentially many other factors that may be a source of interpopulation variation in how fixed or fluid people regard ethno-linguistic identities to be, such as exposure, socioeconomic status, or, I mean, literally anything. We can also see where there are limits to this flexibility, which I think is going to be an interesting one. However, and something that I've been avoiding until now, it's like if we are talking about anything that has to do with an evolved mechanism, it's like I haven't really addressed whether indeed, okay, if different linguistic behaviors are adaptations to changing environments, do they actually lead to different social or economic payoffs? Moreover, if indeed people adapt the way they reason about ethno-linguistic identities in ways that are adaptive, does this actually translate in changes in the social behaviors that they perform based on others' linguistic identities? And for that, I'm going to turn to another field site, also in the same area, where not me, but Karen Kramer has been collecting data for the past 30 years. And this is amazing because this sort of 30-year-long time span spans a full transition from a purely subsistence economy from now a market-integrated community. And Karen has been collecting census data from everybody in this village that now has around between 500 and 600 people for the past 30 years. And now, and as I said, when she started, there were no paved roads, everybody was a subsistence farmer, and there was nobody that participated in wage labor. And now, as in the other village, this is completely different. This means that we can investigate, on the one hand, how changing livelihood opportunities are associated or not with the changing use of indigenous and majority languages, and also whether individual social and economic returns vary across individuals with different language competences. Then, because she's also collected data on social networks, we can evaluate using social network analysis whether the social outcomes of speakers with different linguistic repertoire varies. And therefore, we can see the relative influence of social and economic payoffs on shaping the coexistence of minority and indigenous languages. So the first thing that we needed to know is okay, has this market integration at all led to changes in the use of languages? And it has. And as you can see, the number of Spanish speakers from 1992 to 2017 had essentially doubled, but it had doubled, which is also interesting in a way in which now there is double the amount of bilinguals, but there is still not a single monolingual, which means that we are still not observing a language shift situation. We also see that this increase has been homogeneous across households, which means that it's not just that households that had people speaking Spanish 30 years ago had just continued teaching Spanish to the younger generations, but that this trend has been consistent across the whole village. Again, in order to look at, okay, what it is that predicts whether people will speak Spanish or not in a similar way to in the previous field site, we looked at what factors predicted whether someone would speak Spanish, and we see that, of course, education is the main one because it's in Spanish, but also if your head of household was a committed wage laborer, you were also more likely to speak Spanish. And once again, in line with our former field site, those later born, which is what is indicated by this last term at the bottom of the graph, younger individuals from large families, which means later borns, controlling for age and everything else, were also more likely to be Spanish speakers. But the cool thing about these settings is that, okay, we can not only hypothesize of whether they might be Spanish speakers because they are more likely to be the ones that work for wages, but we can actually test this. And this graph now shows the predictors of engaging in wage labor. When we look at this, we again see that, of course, Spanish is the main determinant of whether you will work in wage labor or not, because you need to speak Spanish, as well as the land you have. So if you have less land, you're more likely to, if you have more land, you're less likely to engage in wage labor. But also, if you are the later born in a large family, you're also much more likely to engage in wage labor. Which means that our hypothesis about the linguistic diversification of the subsistence niche may be true. But again, is this strategy at all advantageous? Which means, does it translate to benefits in the net income that families are getting? And this is precisely what we evaluated next. And we fitted Bayesian mixed models to see whether household economic strategies, as well as the linguistic behaviors of their members, affected the net income that they obtained. And we found that indeed households with wage laborers, so this mixed strategy, had higher net incomes. We also found that households with male heads that spoke Spanish had also higher net incomes when controlling for everything else. Having a female head of household that spoke Spanish did not have an effect on households' net income. And I think this is really interesting, the gender difference, but I'll come back to it later after I discuss the social payoffs, which is what I will do next. So to evaluate the social payoffs, as I said in the previous slide, what we did was to look at the social network outcomes of speakers with different linguistic repertoires, as well as whether there was assortment based on language. So this idea that people will preferentially cooperate with those that speak the same language as them. And for that, we collected ego-centered social networks from all households. We did it at a household level because what we wanted to see was whether household level outcomes were a function of the linguistic strategies of their members. And we collected data on 3 networks. One that comprised who in the village did the egos visit weekly, one that was who in the village did egos help with childcare or food production, so anything related to the household, and another one that was who in the village were egos willing to lend the equivalent sum of money to a week's worth of work. So it's kind of a lot of money. And the first thing that we wanted to see whether indeed people were assorting with each other based on language. And for that, we calculated the assortativity coefficients and we compared them with 1,000 random networks, which is, so the random networks is the box plots that you see, and then the orange diamonds is the actual assortativity coefficients that we observe. So as you can see, for example, here, and in line with the results from our other field site, the way in which people are using language, not just to make inferences about others, but to actually guide social behavior, seem to be strategic and network specific, so by no means universal. So we don't find evidence for language being universally evolved to guide our behavior in a particular way. We also don't find evidence for the general devaluation of the indigenous language, as otherwise we should see just like Spanish speakers assorting with one another for everything. And although we see that individuals were not really using language as a means to like guide whether they would visit one another or not, they were using language in order to, they were preferentially helping others that spoke the same language as them. And this makes sense within the evolutionary literature that suggests that individuals may be motivated to look for in-groups for all kinds of activities, but particularly so for the more costly ones, because coordination failures or like just directing your help towards the wrong person may be more costly. However, for the money network, we observed a negative assortment, which means that Spanish speakers were more likely to lend money to Mayan monolinguals than to other bilinguals like them. And this may sound really weird, but it's actually what we observe in other indigenous communities that are becoming more market integrated, such as the Tsimane here on top, or the Alaskan Inuit at the bottom, which means where it's often found that more market integrated individuals and households are more likely to redistribute their wealth with others from the village. And this is because working for wages removes adult men from their home village for periods of time, and is associated with a greater variability in food production, which means that, and also since they are richer, the cost of giving for them is less, which means that those households may be the ones that redistribute their cash income as a way of gaining access to village networks of social support in which they can rely on, such as the help one, in order to buffer against the risk of this sort of higher variability. So in order to see whether a similar system was happening here in Yucatan, mediated by language, we wanted to see whether indeed speaking Spanish and or engaging in market activities was also associated into the returns that individuals obtained from village social networks. And for that, we looked at whether the in degree and the out degree, so the number of incoming ties and outgoing ties that household got from the social network varied. And again, similarly to what was claimed for the Tsimane or for the Inuit, we found that, and this is not shown in the current picture, that households whose members participated in wage work were not less likely to invest in village networks of social support. And that both in absolute and relative terms to the visiting network, households with Spanish-speaking female heads and male heads could rely on help from the same number of individuals, as you see in the middle graph. However, when we're talking about the money network, this was again different. Households whose male heads spoke Spanish could rely on money loans from more individuals. However, if you were a female head that spoke Spanish, you caused your household to be able to rely on loans from less individuals than if you were not a Spanish speaker. And this is despite the fact that, as I said, female heads of households who spoke Spanish were not less likely to invest in the networks themselves. So in a way, they were being penalized. They were also all domestic workers, so there's no a priori reason why they should be less able to do so. And this means that this result is interesting because it provides sort of unique empirical evidence that within a single community, language use may have different social payoffs for different individuals. And again, we started thinking about why this could be the case, also in line to the previous finding that I said I would come back to. And it's like, okay, so given that Maya women spend more time than men in the village, they are all domestic workers, it may be that they have a central role in building and consolidating these local social relationships, and that this contrasts with, for example, men's primary role as the breadwinner. And therefore, it's sort of women that are responsible for sustaining these traditional social networks, such as the helping network, where this sort of language-based assortment was observed. So what it might be that women are actively selecting partners based on their language, and therefore using Maya as a marker of this sort of like shared cultural affiliation or group commitment. There is also the possibility that this is the result of like sort of opportunity costs that happen for women if acquiring Spanish competencies before establishing their own household. With that, I mean that, for example, since becoming proficient in Spanish is mostly acquired, for example, through education or through working outside the village, the monolingual women are those that when they were younger remained in the village and therefore had more opportunities to forge stronger friendships with one another, which then may have become important once they established their own household and needed to rely on others for social support. And sort of when we try to think about all this heterogeneity that I've been discussing across different domains and sort of try to sort of summarize this part of the talk and relate everything together, I guess what I want to point out is that, okay, when we see, such as in this case, socioeconomic changes happening, in this case it's the market integration situation, we can see emergent bilingualisms such as the one here in Yucatan, and that these emergent bilingualisms can in fact be sustainable rather than a transitionary stage. I have suggested and hope to provide a little bit of evidence that this is because each language allows individuals, households, and the communities to obtain a complementary set of social and economic payoffs that are particularly advantageous in these market integrating and mixed economies. On the one hand, we talk about this like payoffs to retain Mayan in order to access social support networks and sort of create this sort of shared sense of identity that is important for cooperation. And on the other hand, we have Spanish that is a way to access this wage labor, and at the same time it brings this new network, like the money exchange network, to the community, where potentially everybody can benefit from accessing. And I have then shown that whether individuals invest in learning each of these languages and transmitting them has an impact in the social behavior they display towards others and their social reasoning they display towards others based on their linguistic repertoire in a flexible and strategic way in order to, again, reap the payoffs that I've mentioned. And therefore, that understanding this power of socioeconomic changes to redefine the relationship between ethnic and linguistic identity is also particularly important to, on the one hand, assess the prospect of linguistic diversity persisting in the future, and on the other, on how it came to be. And this is a concluding sort of thought that I want to leave you with. But as Robin Dunbar puts in a really nice chapter from like now over 20 years ago, much of the research on language that we've done over the past century of big names such as Pinker, Chomsky, and whoever else has focused on the mechanisms that allow language to encode and transmit an unlimited amount of information, and why it is that it's only humans that do this. But I think, and I hope Robin Dunbar would agree with me, that in order to understand language as a biological phenomenon, we need to understand why it is that it changes so fast. In other words, why both languages and linguistic landscapes are constantly changing. And I hope to have provided some insight into that question by showing that beyond communications, languages serve multiple functions within and between communities. And therefore, rather than an evolved, instinctive, and universal way of using languages and thinking about them, people around the world adapt the ways in which they do this to their local social and ecological realities. And really, whilst I said very, very little in this talk about how linguistic diversity comes about in the first place, what I want to highlight is that only by understanding how it is that changes in social structures can exert selection pressures on practices of language use and language transmission, we can then attempt to predict when variation across different dimensions will be created, maintained, and lost, both now and throughout our evolutionary history. And that is it. I just want to thank everybody that was involved in this project, both in Mexico and all over the world, giving me access to their data and discussing all these hypotheses with me, and also everybody that came and listened.
Thank you, Cecilia. That was really interesting. Great to hear about your research again. If you stop sharing your screen, and then we'll go into the questions at the end. Just before we do, I'm just going to put the link to our YouTube channel where the video of today's session will go online. Okay, can you see the chat?
Yes.
So, Alicia has provided some background, but the basic question is, do you think the advent of such strategic bilingualism affects changes in characteristics of the Yucatec Mayan language itself? Or since ethno-linguistic identity is likely more prominent in a fluctuating socio-ecological environment, will the explicit association between the language and tradition stagnate the typical development of the language?
And I guess she's still here, but does she mean on the actual form of the language, so on the actual like language as itself? Because I think for sure, yes. And there are pressing concerns, and there's also gender differences in this, and it's like, I think, extensively debated amongst linguists that people start regarding and using language both as a way of the form of it, like using, for example, borrowing terms, or like trying to avoid borrowed terms as a way to distinguish or unite themselves with like other communities that may be around them. And this is, but I mean, and this doesn't only happen in Yucatan, this happens all around the world. And I remember reading ethnographies about languages from other places. There is even accounts from ethnographers that you get these situations in which like villages that speak different languages, when they start getting like sort of like really mad at one another or like at war, they start like changing all the words so that they are like less similar to the village nearby, so that they don't think that they are the same thing. And for sure with Yucatan, the same thing is happening, and you get people being concerned that like the Mayan that they speak now is not like the Mayan it used to be, and it's all dirty because these like Spanish speakers had brought it to them. But in a way, we've been having these concerns like in every society and all through history, but it seems that we just need to realize that language itself is also always changing.
Any more questions? I can't remember if you have already spoken about this, but does the number of children in the family affect the sort of diversity within the language within the family group?
No. So the thing is that, so this was one of the interesting things. So family size doesn't, but it was sort of your birth order that did, and in a way, it's like there is just not that much variation in family size. So you either have people that don't have children at all, and this is normally because they are infertile. But those families that do sort of invest into the household system of like, you know, getting married and having children, fertility is insanely high. And it has remained high forever since like I've talked to people, and it's high and healthy in a way, because like infant mortality is super low. So and when I was talking to Karen about it, Karen Kramer, she was like, yeah, this is the puzzle, right? It's like, how are people, despite the fact that they have access to the same amount of land and that the village is increasingly growing and stuff, like how are they able to sustain these like huge families? But they seem to be doing just fine. So
okay, Matt asks, does your perspective agree with Nettle's idea that linguistic diversity correlates positively with resource density, or if not, how could it change that idea?
Yeah, so I, like when I started thinking about linguistic diversity, I started with Nettle's book. But what I have to disagree, I generally like the thought in a way, but what I would say that it doesn't, so because in a way I'm looking at bilingualism here, and I remember when I was reading Nettle's book and I was discussing with Rob Foley, my master's supervisor, this is that they see from the beginning, and Robin Dunbar the same, is like they see language diversity as the outcome of intergroup boundary formation. So there is not really a place in which they consider bilingualism within a group as a linguistic strategy in a particular landscape. So in a way, he doesn't allow for a situation in which instead of an intergroup boundary formation, so what he says is like in a resource-rich landscape, you would be able to form more groups that are smaller or like densely packed in a place and therefore have more diversity, but he would not consider a situation where the strategy is to have members of a single group exploiting more than one language. And it's not just in Yucatan where like a majority language has now come as the product of market integration, but there you have like places like Vanuatu, where not only you have a huge density of languages, but where the average person speaks a lot of them. So I think this is what he doesn't really explain.
We have a question from Andrea Silva. So, hi Cecilia, I love your research, very interesting. I've been performing sleep research in a small Yucatec community, and I was surprised to see how people's sleep knowledge changed according to their exposure to Spanish culture. Have you thought that history, i.e. La Guerra de Casta, or the caste war, has a lot to do with how ethnic identities are linked to linguistics? Wouldn't it be important to include an historical perspective into your study?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I just didn't have time to go to it or to talk about it in a 1 hour talk, but for sure. And the thing is that history repeats itself, and not only through time, but in many geographic spaces. And indeed, pretty much every historical war has had to have an element of language, and language is used to draw boundaries and to differentiate enemies at war, and all that. And in Mexico, it's certainly the case. So yeah, I don't see I don't see why. Like I certainly agree with you in that aspect. I guess I was trying to address more of like an evolutionary question of, are we able to flexibly adapt the way in which we think about others based on language, depending on, for whatever it is that will make that change in mentality profitable for us. Let it be changing historical or social realities, changing economic payoffs, or changing whatever. But yeah.
Okay, well, it's 2:00, so I guess we'll finish up there. Thank you, Cecilia, for joining us today, and thank you everybody for coming, and yeah, we'll see you next week. Okay, thank you.
Bye.